It all started as a small, annoying inconvenience. Every morning, I'd wake up, step outside with a cup of coffee, and reach down to grab my newspaper, only to find nothing. At first, I thought maybe the delivery guy was messing up, but after a few days of this, I knew something was off. My neighbors? They all had their newspapers right on their doorsteps, untouched. That's when it hit me. Someone was stealing my newspaper. I wasn't about to let this slide. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual and waited by the window, eyes locked on my front yard. And sure enough, just as the sun started creeping over the horizon, she appeared. An older woman, dressed in a robe and slippers, casually walked up my driveway like she owned the place. Without a second thought, she bent down, scooped up my newspaper, tucked it under her arm, and walked off as if nothing had happened. My jaw nearly hit the floor. She didn't even hesitate. No guilt, no second glance, just pure entitlement. I needed proof. So the next day, I set up my phone behind the curtain and recorded everything. Same time, same routine. She strolled up, took my newspaper, and left. Now, I had her on camera, but the real question was, why? This wasn't some desperate act. She lived a few houses down in a big, well-kept home. She could easily afford her own damn newspaper. So what was her deal? Power? Habit? Some twisted sense of satisfaction? Whatever it was, I decided it was time to teach her a lesson. At first, I thought about confronting her directly, maybe even printing out screenshots of my video and stuffing them in her mailbox. But that felt too easy. No, she needed something more memorable. That's when the idea hit me. If she wanted to play games, I was going to win. The next morning, I let her take the paper, same as always. But this time, tucked inside was something extra special. A fake eviction notice. Official looking, detailed, and just legit enough to make her heart skip a beat. The setup was perfect. I watched from my window as she grabbed the newspaper, completely unaware of what was inside. She walked off, her usual smug self. But then, not even 5 minutes later, I heard it. A shriek. A full-on panicked scream from down the street. And I knew exactly what part she was reading. It started small. So small that at first, I didn't even notice. One morning, I stepped outside like I always did, half asleep, coffee in hand, expecting to grab my newspaper. But it wasn't there. I frowned, looked around, even checked under the bushes. Nothing. Maybe the delivery guy missed my house? It wasn't a big deal. Annoying, sure, but not the end of the world. I figured it was a one-time mistake. The next morning, the same thing happened. This time, I was more awake, more aware. I stepped out earlier, thinking maybe I could catch the delivery in real time. But no, my neighbors had their newspapers neatly placed on their porches like always. Mine? Nowhere to be seen. That uneasy feeling started creeping in. Was someone taking it? The third morning, I woke up even earlier. I stood behind the curtain, watching my front yard, waiting. The street was quiet, barely any movement. And then, right when the sun began to rise, I saw her. A woman, older, maybe in her late 60s, casually walking down the street in a robe and slippers. She didn't hesitate. She didn't look around. She walked right up to my driveway, bent down, picked up my newspaper, tucked it under her arm like it belonged to her, and walked away. I just stood there, gripping the curtain so tight my fingers hurt. Who the hell did that? She didn't even look guilty. No rush, no glancing over her shoulder. Like it was a routine. Like she had done it before. That's when it clicked. This wasn't random. She had done it before. Maybe she had been doing it for weeks and I just hadn't noticed. The next day I waited again. This time I recorded her. Same time, same routine. She walked right up, took my newspaper and left. I watched the footage over and over, trying to make sense of it. She lived a few houses down, in a well-maintained, expensive home. She wasn't homeless. She wasn't struggling. She chose to steal my newspaper. But why? What kind of person does that? I told myself it wasn't a big deal. It was just a newspaper. But the more I thought about it, the more it got under my skin. It wasn't about the paper anymore. It was about the audacity, the entitlement. I couldn't let it go. So, I started watching her. Not in a creepy way, just observing. She had a routine. She walked every morning, the same time, the same path. She never carried anything except my newspaper. She never acknowledged anyone. And here's where it got weird. Her own newspaper was delivered to her house. I saw it. It sat on her porch, untouched, while she walked down the street and stole mine. At first, I thought maybe she didn't realize she had a subscription. But no, because later in the afternoon, she'd step outside, pick up her newspaper, and take it inside like normal. She knew. She knew she had her own paper, but she still took mine. That's when the paranoia started. I began wondering if she had been doing more than just stealing my newspaper. Had she been watching me? Did she know my schedule? Had she been inside my yard before? Every little noise outside started to make me tense up. I started double-checking my locks, my mailbox, my cameras. I even thought about installing new ones, just in case. Because if she was bold enough to steal something in broad daylight, what else was she capable of? I started leaving little traps. I put a sticky note inside the newspaper, something small that she wouldn't notice until she got home. I know what you're doing. The next day, she still took the newspaper, but something was different. She walked a little faster. She looked around. She was nervous. Good. The next day, I left another note. You should stop. Same reaction. She hesitated before taking the paper, but still took it. I needed to push further, so I left a fake letter inside, something official-looking from the Homeowners Association, warning her that someone had reported a trespasser stealing newspapers in the neighborhood. That one got a reaction. That afternoon, she actually came to my door. She didn't knock. She just stood there, looking at my house for a long time before finally walking away. That night, I barely slept. Every little noise made my heart pound. Had I pissed her off? Was she going to retaliate? I checked my cameras first thing in the morning. She hadn't done anything. Not yet. But then, something else started happening. My mail started going missing. Not every day, just sometimes. Enough to make me paranoid. I never saw her take it. But I knew. I had to end this. The next morning, I watched her again. This time, I had something different inside the newspaper. A fake eviction notice. It was perfectly designed. Legal-sounding jargon, a fake law firm's letterhead, and an official-looking stamp. It stated that the homeowner had been reported multiple times for trespassing and theft, and if the behavior continued, legal action would be taken against them. I placed it inside the newspaper and waited. She took the paper like always, walked home. 5 minutes later, I heard it. A scream. Then, case and I rushed to my window just in time to see her storm out of her house, paper in hand, waving it around. She was yelling at someone on the phone, frantic. She was pacing, running her fingers through her hair, visibly panicked. And then, she started looking around. Not at her house, at mine. My heart nearly stopped. She started walking toward my house. I backed away from the window. My mind raced. What if she knocked? What if she confronted me? What if she knew I did this? Then, she stopped, right at the edge of my driveway. She stood there for what felt like forever, breathing heavily, gripping the paper so tight her knuckles were white. Then, without warning, she turned and walked back to her house. And just like that, she never stole my newspaper again. But that's not even the weirdest part. A few days later, I walked past her house on my way to the store. Something was different. Her newspaper, it was still there, untouched. Days later, it was still sitting there, slowly getting soaked in the rain. She had stopped picking up her own newspaper too. I never saw her outside again. Not on her walks, not getting her mail, not ever. It was like she had disappeared. And to this day, I still don't know why she took my newspaper in the first place, or why she reacted the way she did, or where she went. But I do know one thing. Whatever scared her that day, it wasn't just the eviction notice. You ever wake up in the morning, stretch, yawn, grab a cup of coffee, step outside and think, what a beautiful day to read the news, only to realize your newspaper is gone? Yeah, that happened to me, once, then twice, then a third time. And by the fourth day, I was convinced I had a newspaper poltergeist. I mean, who steals a newspaper in this day and age? It's 2024. You can literally read the news on your phone for free. But nope. Someone was out here treating my newspaper like it was a winning lottery ticket. At first, I thought maybe the delivery guy was getting lazy, tossing it in the wrong yard. So, I did the only logical thing. I checked my neighbors' porches. And guess what? Their newspapers were sitting there, untouched, pristine, glistening in the morning sun like they had just been delivered by angels. But mine, gone, just vanished. Now, I'm not a confrontational person, but there's a special kind of rage that bubbles up when someone messes with your morning routine. Coffee? Essential. Newspaper? Necessary. Some random thief ruining both? Unforgivable. So, I set a trap. I woke up early, camped out behind my window like some suburban detective, and waited. And then, right on schedule, here she came. The newspaper bandit. A little old lady, probably in her late 60s, shuffling down the street in her robe and slippers like she had all the time in the world. And I swear to you, she didn't even hesitate. She walked right up to my porch, bent down, scooped up my newspaper, tucked it under her arm, and strutted off like she had paid for it. I was stunned, flabbergasted, bamboozled. This wasn't some desperate act of necessity. She wasn't homeless. She wasn't struggling. She had her own damn newspaper sitting on her porch. I knew because I walked by her house later that day and saw it just sitting there, lonely, ignored, as if it wasn't good enough for her. Nope, she wanted my newspaper. And suddenly, it wasn't even about the news anymore. This was about principle. Now, I could have just confronted her. But where's the fun in that? No. I needed revenge. And not just any revenge. I needed something memorable. Something that would make her question her life choices. So I started brainstorming. My first idea? Cover the newspaper in Vaseline. Simple, effective, hilarious. I imagined her picking it up, struggling to hold on to it, slipping and sliding as she tried to turn the pages. But then I thought, no, that's too easy. Then, I had the idea. The kind of idea that makes you sit back and smile, because you know it's going to be perfect. I was going to give her a fake eviction notice. Something official looking, something that would send her into an absolute panic. So, I got to work. I printed out a very official-looking letter, complete with a fake legal letterhead, stating that her home had been flagged for unauthorized property acquisition, a fancy way of saying she was stealing. The notice claimed that repeated offenses would result in fines, legal action, and immediate eviction. I even threw in a fake city seal for good measure. It was art. The next morning, I slid the notice inside the newspaper, placed it on my porch, and waited. And oh boy, it was so worth it. Like clockwork, she appeared. She walked up, grabbed the newspaper, and shuffled back home, completely unaware of what was inside. And then, the magic happened. 5 minutes later, I heard it. A shriek. No, a wail. The kind of sound you make when you realize you've been caught in 4K Ultra HD committing a crime you didn't even think was a crime. I peeked out my window just in time to see her bolting out of her house, clutching the newspaper like it was a ticking time bomb. She was waving the eviction notice in the air, talking, no, yelling, on her phone. I could only imagine what that conversation was like. Hello? Yes, I think I'm being kicked out of my house. No, I don't know why. It just says something about stealing. What? No, I would never steal anything. Okay, well, except for the newspaper, but that's not real stealing, right? Right? I was dying, but it got better, because then she started looking around. Her head snapped left, then right. She was scanning the neighborhood like she was trying to spot the secret government agents who had apparently been watching her crime spree. And then she looked directly at my house. I ducked, not because I was scared, but because I was laughing so hard that I nearly choked on my coffee. She stormed down her porch, still clutching the paper, and marched toward my house. And for a second, I thought, oh no, I might have gone too far. But then, plot twist, she stopped at the end of my driveway, stood there, just staring. Now, I don't know if she was debating knocking on my door or if she was just trying to psychically intimidate me from 20 feet away, but either way, it wasn't working. After what felt like an eternity, she turned on her heel and power-walked back to her house. And just like that, she never stole my newspaper again. But wait, there's more. Because for weeks after that, every time I walked past her house, I noticed something strange. Her own newspaper? It just sat there, untouched, day after day. Even when it rained, even when the wind blew it across her yard, she never picked it up again. So, did I break her? Did I send her into some existential crisis where she suddenly questioned the morality of newspaper theft? Did she start believing that the government was secretly tracking small-time newspaper criminals? I don't know. But what I do know is that the newspaper thief retired that day. And I like to think that, somewhere deep down, she now has a little voice in her head that whispers, maybe don't steal people's newspapers, Karen. maybe don't. The first time my newspaper went missing, I thought it was a simple mistake. Maybe the delivery guy had tossed it onto the wrong porch. Maybe a strong gust of wind had carried it away. I didn't think much of it. But when it happened again, and then again, and again, I knew something was wrong. My newspaper wasn't just disappearing, it was being taken. The logical part of my brain told me it wasn't a big deal. Who even reads physical newspapers anymore? But there was something about it, something personal, that gnawed at me. It was the principle, the quiet violation of my routine, the feeling of being watched. Because whoever was stealing it knew exactly when to strike. It always vanished before I could get to it. And that was unsettling. So I did what any rational person would do. I became a detective. The first step, gathering evidence. I started setting my alarm earlier, slipping out of bed before dawn, peeking through the blinds like I was in some kind of suburban stakeout. But no matter how early I woke up, the thief was faster. They had perfected their timing. It was like they knew exactly when I would come outside and snatch the newspaper just moments before I could. That's when I knew this wasn't just random. Someone was watching me too. I needed more than just my own eyes. I needed technology. So I set up a motion-activated camera, hidden in the bushes near my porch. It was small, discreet, the kind of thing you wouldn't notice unless you were looking for it. I waited until nightfall, installed the camera, and went to bed, heart pounding with anticipation. Tomorrow, I thought. Tomorrow, I'll have my answer. And I did. The next morning, my newspaper was gone. But this time, I had proof. I rushed to my laptop, pulled up the footage, and pressed play. The screen flickered. The porch came into view. The timestamp read 5:42 a.m. And then, movement. A shadow crept into the frame. My breath caught in my throat. And then, her. An old woman, dressed in a thick bathrobe and fuzzy slippers, shuffled onto my porch. She bent down, snatched up my newspaper like it belonged to her, and waddled off without a care in the world. I blinked, rewound, watched again. It wasn't some hardened criminal. It wasn't a desperate scavenger. It was a sweet-looking old lady, someone's grandmother, someone you'd expect to see feeding pigeons in the park, not committing pre-dawn newspaper heists. And yet, something about her felt off. I zoomed in on the footage. She moved with purpose, like she'd done this 100 times before. Her face was eerily blank, expressionless, almost mechanical. And as she turned to leave, something caught my eye. A flicker of satisfaction. The faintest hint of a smirk. She knew. She knew she was getting away with it. I had to know more. So, I did something drastic. I followed her. The next morning, I dressed in dark clothes, stayed hidden behind a row of hedges, and waited. My heart pounded as I saw her approach. She moved like a phantom, appearing out of nowhere, stepping onto my porch with the same calculated ease. I held my breath as she grabbed my newspaper and turned away. I let her walk a few houses down before I slipped onto the sidewalk, staying low, keeping my distance. She moved at a slow but steady pace, the newspaper tucked under her arm like a prized possession. She turned the corner, and I followed. Then, she stopped. My breath caught. I pressed myself against a tree, watching as she glanced around, almost like she knew someone was tailing her. But after a moment, she continued. I exhaled. She reached a modest house with neatly trimmed hedges. A normal house. A house that gave no hint that its owner was secretly a newspaper thief. I watched as she climbed the steps, entered the house, and closed the door behind her. I waited. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3. And then, against all reason, I walked up to her porch. I didn't know what I was looking for. Clues? A confession note? A shrine dedicated to stolen newspapers? But what I found was worse, because sitting on her porch, completely untouched, was her own newspaper. I stared at it, my mind racing. Why was she stealing mine if she had her own? Did she think my newspaper was better? Was she testing me? Was this some kind of game? I needed answers. I did something I never thought I'd do. I rang the doorbell. A moment later, the door creaked open, and there she was, the newspaper bandit. Up close, she looked even older than I expected. Frail, hunched, but with eyes that were too sharp. Yes? She asked, tilting her head. I swallowed. Hi, I live a few houses down. I was just wondering if you've seen anyone suspicious in the neighborhood lately. Her expression didn't change. Suspicious? I nodded. Yeah, Someone's been stealing my newspaper every morning. For a moment, she just stared at me. Then she smiled. Oh, she said, her voice almost playful. That's awful. A chill ran down my spine. I forced a laugh. Yeah, crazy, right? She nodded, her smile never faltering. Well, I do hope you find out who's behind it. Something about the way she said it, like she knew I knew, sent a shiver through me. I thanked her, turned, and walked away, resisting the urge to sprint. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I had proof. I had confronted her. And yet, she wasn't scared. She wasn't embarrassed. If anything, she was amused. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about the newspaper. This was a challenge. She wanted me to catch her. She wanted to play the game. And now, I had to decide whether or not to play along. The first time my newspaper went missing, I didn't think much of it. Maybe it had blown away. Maybe the delivery guy had messed up. It wasn't a big deal. But then it happened again, and again, and again. Every morning, I'd step out onto my porch and the newspaper would be gone. No sign of it anywhere. No discarded pages fluttering down the street. No half-crumpled remains tossed aside like garbage. Just vanished. It was weird, but not scary. Not yet. That changed the night I saw the shadow. I had started waking up earlier, hoping to catch whoever was taking it. I'd sit by the window, lights off, peering through the blinds like some kind of suburban detective. At first, I saw nothing. The street was empty, silent. But then, at exactly 3:33 a.m., I saw movement. A figure. It stood at the edge of my yard, just beyond the street lamp's glow. Not moving, not approaching, just standing there, watching. I couldn't make out details. Too dark, too far away. But something about it felt wrong. Its posture, maybe? Too still, too rigid. The way its head tilted slightly, like it was listening to something only it could hear. I shivered, but told myself it was nothing. Just some weirdo out for a late-night walk. Coincidence. But then the next morning, my newspaper was gone again. And the footprints were on my porch. I didn't sleep well that night. The next morning, I checked my camera. I had set it up after the first few thefts, assuming I'd catch some bored teenager or a nosy neighbor. But when I played back the footage, my stomach turned to ice. The street was empty. The porch was empty. Nothing moved. But then, suddenly, at exactly 3:33 a.m., my newspaper disappeared. Not picked up, not swiped by some unseen hand, just gone. Like someone had edited reality itself. I rewound, played it again, again. Each time the same thing. 1 second, the newspaper was there. The next, it wasn't. No movement, no distortion, no sign of how it happened. My hands shook as I shut my laptop. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a theft anymore. This was something else. That night, I locked my doors, closed my curtains, kept the lights off, but I didn't sleep. I sat awake, heart pounding, waiting. The clock crept forward. 3:30, 3:31, 3:32, and then 3:33. The air changed. The room felt smaller, heavier, like something unseen had pressed against the walls, squeezing them inward. My ears rang with a sound I couldn't quite hear, a low, droning hum, just beneath the edge of perception. My chest felt tight. My breath came faster, and then, outside my window, something moved. It was closer this time, right at the edge of my lawn. I could see its silhouette now, thin, too thin, with limbs that seemed wrong, elongated, stretched. It didn't stand like a person. Its head was cocked at a sharp angle, unmoving. It knew I was watching, and then it took a step forward. I sucked in a breath, forcing myself not to move, not to react. Another step and another. It was at the bottom of my porch now, inches from the first step. My stomach clenched. My pulse thundered in my ears. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. Then, with an eerie, deliberate slowness, it crouched down, and it reached out. Not for my door, not for the doorknob, but for the exact spot where my newspaper should have been. Except tonight, there was no newspaper. Its fingers curled over empty space, hesitant, confused, and then it turned its head toward me. A slow, unnatural movement, too smooth, too precise. And for the first time, I saw them. Its eyes. They weren't eyes at all, just two empty, gaping sockets, stretching far too wide, far too deep. And then it smiled. I don't remember what happened next. One second, I was staring at it, frozen. The next, I was waking up on my floor, drenched in cold sweat, the clock blinking 6:00 a.m. My whole body ached. My throat was raw, like I had been screaming. I bolted for the door, flung it open. My porch was normal, no footprints, no strange figures. And yet, in the exact spot where my newspaper should have been, something else lay there instead. A single sheet of paper, torn, yellowed, ancient-looking, and on it, scrawled in impossibly small, jagged handwriting, were just 3 words: "See you tonight." I never thought a missing newspaper would teach me about entitlement, privilege, and the strange, unspoken rules of suburban life. At first, it was just a minor inconvenience. Every morning, I'd step outside expecting to find my neatly folded newspaper on the porch, only to be greeted by empty space. I blamed the delivery guy, the wind, maybe a stray dog, but deep down, something felt off. It wasn't random. It was happening too often, too deliberately. Someone was taking it. I could have let it go. It was just a newspaper after all, but the principle of it bothered me. Someone, somewhere in my neighborhood, had decided that they had more right to my property than I did. Maybe it was a small thing, but wasn't that how bigger injustices started? Someone crossing a tiny line, thinking it didn't matter, until one day, that tiny line was a boundary no one cared about anymore. I started paying attention, watching my neighborhood with fresh eyes, and suddenly, I noticed things I'd never paid attention to before. The way certain people let their dogs roam free while others were fined for it. The way some lawns could be overgrown without consequence while others got complaints. The way the same people who whispered about community values seemed to be the ones bending the rules in their favor. And then, one morning, I caught her. Mrs. Randall, she was in her 60s, dressed in her usual floral print blouse, hair curled into tight, perfect rings. The kind of woman who prided herself on knowing everyone's business. She didn't even try to be sneaky. She walked right up my driveway, bent down, took my newspaper like it belonged to her, and walked away. Just like that. I stood there, stunned. Of all the people I expected, I hadn't thought it would be her, Mrs. Randall, the self-proclaimed moral backbone of the neighborhood. The woman who always talked about personal responsibility and respect for others. The one who had scolded a teenager last week for riding his bike too fast near her house. And yet, here she was, taking something that wasn't hers without a second thought. I could have confronted her right then, called out her hypocrisy, but I didn't. Not yet. Because I knew something she didn't. I wasn't letting this go. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual and prepared my trap. Instead of a normal newspaper, I printed out a fake eviction notice. Bold letters. Official-looking format. The kind of thing that would send a jolt of panic through anyone's veins. At exactly 6:30 a.m., I placed it neatly on my porch, then retreated inside and waited. Sure enough, right on time, Mrs. Randall appeared. She didn't even hesitate, just bent down, grabbed it, and walked off. And then, the fun began. Less than 10 minutes later, I heard it. A high-pitched, horrified scream, followed by the sound of frantic footsteps. I peeked through my window just in time to see her rushing back toward my house, clutching the paper in her trembling hands. Her face was pale, her mouth opening and closing as if struggling for words. She didn't knock. She pounded on my door. When I answered, I made sure to look groggy, like I had just woken up. "Mrs. Randall?" I said, faking a yawn. "Everything okay?" She shoved the paper toward me, her hands shaking. What is this?" I blinked at it, pretending to read. "Oh, wow, an eviction notice? That's crazy. What does it say?" She looked at me like I had grown a second head. "You don't know? It's your house." I scratched my head. "Oh, well, I haven't gotten my newspaper lately, so I haven't been able to check for important notices." I let the words sink in, watched as realization dawned on her face, watched as the horror of what she had done fully registered. She tried to recover, but the damage was done. I didn't mean to steal my newspaper," I said, my voice light, conversational. "Because that's what you've been doing, right?" Every morning, her mouth opened, then shut. She had no defense, no excuse. And for the first time, I saw it. That flicker of shame, buried beneath layers of entitlement. She handed me back the paper without another word and walked away, shoulders hunched. I didn't see her much after that. The next morning, my real newspaper was right where it should be, untouched. But the best part? A week later, at the next neighborhood meeting, Mrs. Randall stood up and made a speech about how we all needed to be better neighbors, how we should respect each other's property, and lead by example. The irony nearly killed me, but I said nothing, because sometimes the best revenge isn't yelling, it isn't even exposing someone, it's letting them expose themselves. It started as an inconvenience, a minor frustration that I could have ignored. But small things have a way of festering, turning into something bigger than they should be. It's never just about the thing itself, it's about what it represents. And this was about boundaries, respect, the unspoken rules of living among others. At first, I assumed it was a mistake. The newspaper delivery was unreliable sometimes. Maybe they'd tossed it into the bushes. Maybe a stray dog had dragged it away. But then it happened again and again. The empty spot on my porch every morning, like clockwork. Someone was taking it. It was a strange thing to steal. Not money, not packages, a newspaper. But that's what made it worse, because it meant whoever was doing it didn't even think it was stealing. They thought it was theirs to take. So, I started watching. I woke up earlier than usual, making my coffee while peeking through the blinds, waiting. The first few days, nothing happened. But on the fifth morning, I saw her. She moved with casual confidence, like she had done this 1,000 times before. A woman in her 60s dressed in a crisp cardigan, her silver hair pinned neatly back. Mrs. Caldwell, my neighbor, the same woman who had once knocked on my door to complain about my recycling bin being too close to her driveway. She bent down, picked up my newspaper, and walked away without hesitation. I should have confronted her, should have called her out right then, but I didn't, because in that moment, I realized something. This wasn't just about a newspaper. This was about power. Mrs. Caldwell was the kind of person who thrived on control. She wasn't just taking my newspaper, she was making a statement. Your things are mine if I decide they are. It was in the way she carried herself, in the way she never asked for anything. She took it. I needed proof. The next morning, I set up my phone near the window, recording as she approached. Same time, same routine. She bent down, grabbed the newspaper, and walked off without so much as a glance around. It was so practiced, so deliberate, that it made my skin crawl. I had her. But what now? I could confront her, but people like Mrs. Caldwell didn't apologize. They rationalized, twisted the narrative. Oh, I thought you weren't reading them. I was just borrowing it. You're overreacting. No, I needed something better, something that would make her feel the frustration I had been feeling for weeks. So, I planned. The next morning, I replaced my real newspaper with something else, an official-looking document with a bold, red stamp across the top. Notice of lawsuit, theft, and harassment. I watched from the window as she picked it up. She barely glanced at it before walking away. And then, I waited. Minutes passed, then an hour, then a knock at my door. Not a polite knock, a demanding one. I took my time answering. When I finally opened the door, Mrs. Caldwell stood there, gripping the paper in white-knuckled hands. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a tight, thin line. "What?" she said, her voice controlled but trembling. "Is this?" I feigned confusion. "Oh, my newspaper? I wouldn't know. I haven't been getting it lately." She narrowed her eyes. "This lawsuit notice." I tilted my head. "Why are you asking me?" Her fingers twitched, crumpling the edges of the paper. "Because it was in your newspaper." I stared at her, letting the silence stretch. Then, finally, I spoke. "My newspaper?" Her mouth opened, then shut. It was such a small moment, but I saw it. The flicker of realization, the unspoken admission. She had no excuse, no justification. She had walked right into her own trap. I could have humiliated her further, could have pushed, made her squirm, but I didn't need to. The damage was done. She shoved the paper back into my hands and stormed off without another word. And just like that, my newspaper was never stolen again. Some battles aren't won by fighting. Some are won by simply holding up a mirror and letting people see themselves for who they truly are. You ever wake up one day and realize you're living in a sitcom, but you're the only one who didn't get the script? That's what this whole thing felt like. A ridiculous, over-the-top prank war, except I hadn't signed up for it. And my opponent? A 70-something-year-old newspaper kleptomaniac who had somehow decided my front porch was her personal newsstand. It started like most things do, with me, half asleep, stumbling onto my porch one morning, only to find that my newspaper had disappeared. Again, now, I'm not some old-school coffee and paper kind of guy. I've got a phone. The news is literally in my pocket. But this was principle. My newspaper, my porch, and some neighborhood goblin had been stealing it every morning before I even had the chance to pretend I was going to read it. Naturally, I did what any reasonable adult would do. I set a trap. Now, let's get something straight. I wasn't about to go full Home Alone on this lady. No tripwires, no swinging paint cans, just a little gentle psychological warfare. I started by replacing my actual newspaper with something special, an exclusive edition, if you will. The front page? A completely fabricated, absolutely deranged eviction notice. Oh yeah, big, bold letters. Something about imminent foreclosure, violations of the Geneva Convention, and, my personal favorite, a dramatic warning that failure to vacate the property within 48 hours would result in mandatory exile to Florida. I tucked it neatly into the plastic sleeve, placed it on the porch, and waited. Right on schedule, she appeared. Mrs. Caldwell, the nosiest, most entitled retiree on the block. She swooped in like a seagull on a French fry, snatched up the paper, and scuttled off. I didn't have to wait long for the fallout. The scream that echoed through the neighborhood was Chef's kiss, a beautiful, operatic shriek of pure horror. A door slammed, a phone was dialed, and before I could even settle in with my coffee, Mrs. Caldwell was on my porch, looking like she had just seen the ghost of the housing market crash. She waved the eviction notice in my face like it was some sacred text she had uncovered in the ruins of my driveway. "Do you see this?" she screeched. I took a long, slow sip of my coffee. "That's funny. I haven't seen that. You know why? Because somebody's been stealing my newspaper." Her face twitched. Oh, she knew. She knew. But entitlement is a hell of a drug, and instead of backing down, she doubled down. "This is illegal," she huffed, shaking the paper. "You can't just scare people like this." I arched an eyebrow. "Oh, you mean like stealing someone's property every morning?" Silence. Beautiful, awkward silence. Now, here's where a normal person might feel bad, might apologize, might say, "Hey, you know what? Maybe I shouldn't have been committing minor theft on a daily basis." But Mrs. Caldwell? Oh no, she was too deep into the game. She had been bested and she knew it, but that just made her madder. "Well," she sniffed, "you could have just asked me to stop." "Funny," I said. "I could have also read my own newspaper." She stomped off without another word. And just like that, my newspaper stopped disappearing. Moral of the story? Sometimes, revenge isn't about getting even. Sometimes, it's about making someone realize they were never winning to begin with. I don't know when exactly I started taking the newspaper. Maybe it was a week ago. Maybe a month. Time moves differently when you're retired. Days blur together. Morning routines become habits. And before you know it, you're doing things without even thinking about them. That's what the newspaper had become for me. Just another part of my morning. Wake up, stretch, step outside, and there it was, waiting for me. A crisp, folded stack of information sitting so perfectly on my neighbor's porch that it almost felt like he was leaving it for me. At first, I only took it once. I told myself it wasn't a big deal. He probably had the internet, right? Young people don't even read newspapers anymore. But then the next day, it was there again. And the day after that, the temptation was too much. Why should it go to waste? He wasn't even outside to grab it. If he really wanted it, wouldn't he wake up early like I did? So I kept taking it. Every morning, just as the sun rose, I'd shuffle out in my slippers, make sure no one was watching, and scoop it up. It felt harmless, maybe even necessary. I had my coffee, my chair by the window, and my morning paper, just like the old days. But then something changed. One morning, as I unrolled the newspaper, expecting the usual updates on local politics and some fluff piece about a rescued dog, I was met with something else. Bold letters, a headline that didn't make sense. Notice of eviction. My hands froze, my stomach twisted, My heart, which normally needed a good 2 cups of coffee before it even thought about working properly, was suddenly pounding like a drum. I scanned the page. Due to repeated violations, the occupant of this residence must vacate the premises within 48 hours. Further noncompliance may result in legal action and immediate removal. I blinked. My hands started to shake. Was this a mistake? A joke? It had to be, right? But there was so much detail. Addresses, legal jargon, deadlines. Oh God, oh God, oh God, oh God. I felt my throat tighten. How could this happen? I paid my bills. I followed the rules. Wait, this wasn't addressed to me. My eyes darted back to the top of the page. The address. The name. It wasn't mine. My mind started piecing it together like a horrible, slow-moving train crash. This wasn't my eviction notice. It belonged to, my neighbor, the one whose newspaper I had been stealing. Panic hit me like a truck. Had I taken his only warning? Did he even know he was being kicked out? Oh dear Lord, did I just doom him to homelessness? My breath came in short, rapid bursts. I felt my palms go sweaty. What do I do? Do I return it? Do I act like I never saw it? Do I knock on his door and confess that I might have single-handedly destroyed his life? No, I couldn't let him know. I couldn't let anyone know. This was a federal crime, wasn't it? Tampering with mail? I was going to prison. They were going to lock me up with the real criminals, the ones with tattoos and muscles and terrifying nicknames. I needed to fix this. I needed to put it back before anyone noticed. But as I hurried toward my front door, the paper clutched in my trembling hands, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. A knock. Slow. Deliberate. I froze. Through the peephole, I saw him, my neighbor, standing on his porch, looking directly at mine. And he was smirking. That's when it hit me. The realization crawled up my spine like a cold, dead hand. This wasn't a real eviction notice. This was a trap. He knew. He knew I had been taking his paper, and he had set me up. My stomach flipped. My whole world felt like it was tilting. I wasn't the hunter. I was the prey. And the worst part? I had fallen for it. The second my alarm buzzed at 6 a.m., I was up. Not because I was excited for the day. No, I had a mission. For weeks, my newspaper had been disappearing, and today was the day I finally caught the thief. I had tried everything, waking up early, checking security footage, even marking the paper with a small invisible dot. But every single morning, it was gone, just vanished into thin air. I had my theories. Maybe it was a nosy neighbor. Maybe it was some kid playing a prank. Or, worst case scenario, maybe it was a raccoon with a weird obsession with current events. But today, I was getting my answer. I moved like a trained operative, silent, focused, eyes locked on the target, my front porch. My hidden camera was already rolling, but I wanted to see the culprit with my own eyes. No more guessing, no more mysteries, just cold, hard proof. Minutes ticked by. My grip tightened around my coffee mug. And then, movement. A shadow. A figure creeping towards my doorstep. My pulse spiked. The adrenaline hit me like a shot of espresso straight to the veins. There she was, an old woman, wrapped in a bathrobe, moving like she'd done this 1,000 times before. Without hesitation, she bent down, scooped up my newspaper, tucked it under her arm, and turned to leave. Oh, hell no. I exploded out the door. Hey! She froze. The paper nearly slipped from her grasp. I had never seen an elderly woman move that fast. She bolted like I had just screamed fire instead of hey. But I wasn't about to let her get away. This was my paper. The chase was on. She took off across the lawn and I followed, my bare feet slamming against the pavement. She had a surprising lead on me, but I was younger, faster. She ducked between houses, slipping through a backyard like some kind of geriatric ninja. "Stop running!" I shouted, dodging a sprinkler. "Stop chasing me!" she yelled back, sprinting down the street. What kind of grandmother had this kind of stamina? Was she training for the Senior Olympics? She cut left into an alley, and I skidded after her, nearly knocking over a trash can. She was almost gone, but then, luck was on my side. A fence. Dead end. She turned, panting, eyes darting like a trapped animal. My lungs burned, but I had her. "All right, lady," I said, hands on my knees. "Explain." She hesitated, clutched the newspaper like it was her lifeline. I needed it," she admitted, breathless. "I don't have a subscription." I blinked. "So, you just stole mine?" She shrugged. You weren't using it. How do you know? You don't even live here. She looked away. I saw you getting your news from your phone. Unbelievable. You've been stalking me? She waved a dismissive hand. Not stalking, just observing. My jaw clenched. Give me my newspaper. She held it tighter. I just read the headlines. I put it back sometimes. Sometimes? Do you hear yourself? Silence. A tense standoff. Two warriors. One newspaper. And then I had an idea. A brilliant idea. I straightened, took a deep breath, and said, Fine, keep it. Her eyes narrowed. What's the catch? No catch, I said smoothly. In fact, tomorrow's paper is yours too. She didn't trust me. Smart. But she was curious. And that's exactly what I wanted. The next morning, I woke up early, earlier than usual, and I left a special surprise waiting on my porch. Not a real newspaper, a fake one, with a front-page story she'd never forget. Local woman arrested for newspaper theft. Neighbor finally catches infamous bandit. Her photo, captured from my security footage, was printed right under the headline. I waited, and sure enough, there she was. She picked up the paper, unrolled it, paused. I saw her eyes scan the fake article, her face slowly draining of color. She gasped, looked around, paranoid. Then, she ran. And this time, she didn't come back. Call it justice, call it revenge, call it whatever you want. But I had won. And if you love stories like this, if you enjoy the thrill, the chase, the sweet, satisfying payback, then you're in the right place. Hit that subscribe button, because trust me, there's plenty more where this came from.